Welcome to Wrestling with Philosophy. I'm your coach, Amit Palmer. Begin. Hey guys, welcome back. We're here for part 2 of Plato's Book 9. In this section, Plato actually makes 3 arguments. We're just looking at the last 2, and this is the second of the last 2, arguing that the just person is going to be happier than the unjust person. And so the way he's going to do this in this second argument, which is actually the third argument in the text, is he's going to argue that the kind of pleasure that you get from the pursuit of knowledge in the philosophical life is more real and more substantive than the kind of pleasures you get from fulfilling the bodily desires. So to summarize, the philosophical life gives you pleasures that taste great and are more filling. So in this first section of the argument, Plato is going to argue that the bodily pleasures, the ones that a lot of people pursue, the money lovers and people who like to eat fancy food or like to have shiny things, these sorts of pleasures are actually illusory, and they aren't genuine pleasures in the way that the pleasures of the mind are real pleasures. So how does he do this? So first, he's going to argue that because most people think of pleasure and pain in bodily terms, that they have a false view of pleasure and pain. And so he's going to show that this understanding of pleasure and pain as being opposites with an intermediate state is false. And then he's going to explain why people are mistaken, and then he's going to give us what he believes to be the correct view. So if we accept the view that pain and pleasure are opposites, let's suppose it's true, Plato asks, well, is there an intermediate state between pleasure and pain? And we might think, yes, there is. That's the state of tranquility. We're neither feeling pleasure, we're not aroused, and we're not feeling pain. We don't feel discomfort. We're just in a state of calm. But then Plato notices that people who are sick, when they recover from their sickness after having been sick for a while, they generally feel as though they're in a pleasant state, even though they don't have positive pleasure in the sense where maybe if you're eating ice cream or you're watching a good movie. So another example might be you have a test coming up and you're just in this state of high anxiety, and then after the test is over, you feel as though you're in a state of pleasure. So it seems like if you're coming from a state of pain to an intermediate state, that intermediate state feels like pleasure. Furthermore, sometimes you can be in a state of pleasure, and then when the pleasure is removed, you actually feel discomfort. So sometimes maybe you're with somebody, your best friend, or it's your partner, and you're really happy around them, and then they go on a long trip. Now, you're not in pain, but the fact that you came out of the state of pleasure feels like discomfort and painful to you. So here's the problem. Suppose I have a ball that is only one color, and then I say to you, that ball is red, it's blue, and it's green. You would say to me that that's not possible. If the ball is all one color, then it must be only one of those colors. And so the same is going on here with our understanding of the intermediate state between pain and pleasure. On some views, it looks like the intermediate state is just a state of tranquility. But also the intermediate state appears as though it can be a state of pain if we're coming from a state of pleasure. And the intermediate state can also be a state of pleasure if we're coming from a state of pain. And so this puts us into a logically untenable position. If we are going to say that there is a truth about what this intermediate state is between pain and pleasure, it can only be one of those things. It can't be all three. Otherwise, it's like we're saying the ball is all one color, yet it's also three colors. So it looks like this simple view that pain and pleasure are opposites, if we follow those premises out, it leads to a logical contradiction. And so that tells us that the position cannot be a true one. Now, there's another important theme to keep track of in Plato. Plato is really concerned about appearances versus truth. So what he says is that when we move from a state of pain to a state of no pain, it will give us the appearance of being in a state of pleasure. But that's not the truth of the matter. Similarly, if I move from a state of pleasure and that pleasure is removed, then it will have the appearance of pain. But that's not the truth of the matter. And so what I want to do as a philosopher is get past the appearances of my experiences and find out the truth. And for those of you keeping track of one of the dominant themes of this course, this ties back into subjective versus objective. So subjectively, I might feel the absence of pain as pleasure, but Plato is going to argue that from an objective point of view, I'm actually mistaken about the nature of my state. Okay, so by showing that the pain-pleasure opposites view leads to a contradiction, he's undermined the argument, but now he's going to go one step further, and he's going to explain why people make this mistake.
You keep it to a house! No!
And the reason why they make this mistake is because this is usually how they experience pleasure, because most pleasures people experience or pursue are the bodily pleasures. And so when I am hungry and I eat, so the hunger is a state of discomfort, especially if I'm really hungry, if I'm really thirsty, and then when I eat, I have this feeling of what I believe to be pleasure. But Plato's going to argue that this isn't genuine pleasure, it's an illusion. So to understand how his argument is going to work, he's going to first begin with an analogy for what he's going to argue further. So he asks us, do you think that in nature there is a bottom, a middle, and a top? Or a down, middle, up? So yes, of course. So just imagine a person who only knows of the bottom and of the middle. They don't know that there's an up or a top. When they move from the bottom to the middle, they will think that they're at the top. With the bodily pleasures, this is what Plato's going to argue is happening. When we experience what we believe to be pleasure, it's because we're moving from a bottom state where we have an emptiness. So I lack food, I lack something to drink, I lack sexual gratification, and then so when that desire is fulfilled, or when that emptiness is fulfilled, I move to the middle state, which I think is the top state, and I experience it as pleasure. Now, the next part of the argument requires you to know a little bit about Plato's metaphysics. So, from the first argument we looked at, we understand that Plato divides the human soul up into three parts. There's the appetitive part, where we have all our bodily appetites. There's the honor-loving part, where we strive for power and recognition and honor. And then the highest part of the human soul is the knowledge-loving part, or the mind. There's also a corresponding hierarchy of reality when it comes to things in the world. Now, Plato's view is quite different from our modern view of what exists. So for Plato, concepts are more real than things in the world, than particular things in the world. Think of it this way. In order for there to be a chair, somebody first had to have the concept of a chair. And so the existence of a chair depends on there being a concept of chair first. And so because the particular chair's existence depends on there being a concept of chair, then the concept is more real than the particular chair. Furthermore, I can destroy all the chairs in the world, but I will never be able to destroy the concept of a chair. Similarly, the principles of mathematics, physics, the moral law, the laws of harmony for what makes good music, the laws of cadence and rhythm for good poetry. All these laws are eternal. They're universal and they're indestructible. They are there for us to discover. Maybe we don't know them all, but through introspection and through exercise of reason, we can discover them. And they can never be destroyed. But particular things can always be destroyed. And particular things, so like I say a particular piece of music, depends for its existence on the laws of harmony. And so the laws of harmony are more real than the particular piece of music. Okay, so let's relate all three ideas. So we have a hierarchy of existence, we have a hierarchy in the soul, and also what Plato's trying to argue for is the hierarchy of kinds of pleasure. And so when I get my pleasure from my mind interacting with truth, knowledge, and wisdom, things that are eternal, because for Plato, truth is eternal, because those things are at the highest level of reality, then the kind of pleasure that comes from from my mind interacting from those kinds of things is also a kind of pleasure that is at the highest level of reality. It is the most real kind of pleasure. When I get pleasure from fulfilling my bodily desires, I get first of all, my body, to satisfy my appetite, is at the lowest level of being, and the kinds of things that I interact with to satisfy those desires are also at the lowest level of being. It's always particulars. It's like a particular food, particular hamburger, particular drink, particular bottle of wine. So correspondingly, the pleasure that comes from the things that are the lowest reality, the pleasure itself must be at a lower level of reality than the pleasure I get from the things that are the highest level of reality. And so this is why people who pursue the satisfaction of their various appetites or the pursuit of money are confused about what the middle state is and what the actual top state is, because they're always chasing their pleasures or money. And so they confuse the middle state for the top state. In order to get to the top state, you have to experience the most real kinds of pleasures, which come from interacting with things that are eternal and universal and true. In short, if you live the philosophical life, you'll get more and higher quality pleasure. Conversely, if you live a life in pursuit of satisfying your various appetites, or chasing money, or chasing social recognition, or power, you will only pursue knowledge and wisdom to the point that they give you the satisfaction of those appetites. And so you are missing out on this whole upper rung of higher quality and quantity pleasure. As such, you will confuse the middle state for pleasure when the genuine pleasure is up at the top, when you're up in the filled life. And so now let's go back to the whole point of this argument, which is that the person who is just is going to be is going to have a happier life than the person who is unjust. Now, it's important also to remind you that just for Plato doesn't just mean only like in the law or in the moral law. He's talking about having all the domains of your life arranged in harmony. So you devote the right amount of time and effort to each domain in your life. So the person who seeks knowledge will have the knowledge, the capacity to reason, and the capacity to evaluate arguments to understand how they should best organize and value the various domains in their life. The person who primarily lives their life chasing the fulfillment of their appetites, so the bodily type pleasures, or even social recognition, this type of person doesn't acquire the types of pleasures that you would get if they devoted more time to pursuing wisdom and knowledge. And because, as we learned in the first part, the money lover and the honor seeker only pursue knowledge insofar as it gives them the thing that they care about. So for the money lover, it's money, and for the honor seeker, it's honor and recognition. They will have less knowledge to fold back and reflect on their life and make adjustments in the ordering and the harmony of their various different domains in life. And this leads me to one of my favorite passages, which I'll read. Therefore, those who have no experience of reason or virtue, but are always occupied with feasts and the like, are brought down and then back up to the middle, as it seems, and wander in this way throughout their lives, never reaching beyond this to what is truly higher up, never looking up at it or being brought up to it. And so they aren't filled with that which really is, and never taste any stable or pure pleasure. Instead, they always look down on the ground like cattle, and with their heads bent over the dinner table, they feed, fatten, and fornicate. To outdo others in these things, they kick and butt them with iron horns and hooves, killing each other, because their desires are insatiable. For the part that they're trying to fill is like a vessel full of holes, and neither it nor the things that they are trying to fill it with are among the things that are. So by things that are, he means things that have the greatest amount of reality. So in order to drive the point home, Plato gives us a vivid image to illustrate exactly what it would be like to compare an unjust life versus a just life with respect to happiness. So he says, let's imagine a mythical creature. Now, it's going to be various creatures intertwined into one. So the first creature is going to be a beast with many heads. So this represents all of your bodily desires. And at any given point, one head is going to dominate. Maybe sometimes you're hungry, sometimes you want money, sometimes you want to have sex, sometimes you want to drink alcohol, sometimes you want fancy cars. All the different heads represent the various different desires that drive people to do what they do. Now, he says, now imagine that's the biggest one. Now imagine also tied to that monstrous beast is a lion. And the lion represents the pride-loving, the honor-loving, and the reputation-loving, and the victory-loving part of the soul. And then also growing out of that torso, supporting the other ones, is a human head. And that represents the part of the soul which makes us distinctively human, which is the rational part of the soul. Now imagine all three of those tied together into one body. Now suppose we feed only the beast part of that mythical creature, meaning the multi-headed part of it, not the lion part, not the human part. Eventually, the beast part is going to get so big and strong, it's going to overtake the others, and it will drag them along, trying to satisfy its various changing desires. And the same is going to happen if we let the lion get too strong. The lion is going to drag the human along. Now, someone who argues that the unjust life is the happiest life, what they're really saying is we should feed that crazy beast that represents our appetites and have the human part, the rational part, be dragged around, and also the honorable part be dragged around by our appetites. What they want to say is that that's the happiest life. Now, somebody who says that the honor-loving life is the happiest life is saying that the human part of us should be dragged around by our love of honor, and that also our appetites should be held hostage to our love of honor. So the things that we ought to pursue are the things that subordinate the multi-headed crazy beast to the human part of the soul. Now we're getting back again to the core question. He says, well, so suppose somebody makes financial gains unjustly, in a way that isn't virtuous. Does this truly benefit them? And the answer is no, because they're feeding the multi-headed crazy beast and making the human part of the soul subordinate to that beast. And so again, it's not that Plato is saying you should never earn money, or you should never eat, or you should never worry about what other people think about you. It's that you have to do things. You have to have a harmonious ordering of these various desires and parts of your soul. And the only way to get that harmonious ordering right is to pursue knowledge, wisdom, and truth, because it is only according to principles of reason that we can get the alignment right. Okay, one last comment on the recursive effects of feeding the various parts of our soul. So if I do something out of motive for money, you might think, I just do it one time. How's it going to throw the harmonious ordering of my life off? Well, because every time you act in a way that is unjust, you are feeding the unjust, the crazy multi-headed beast. You are increasing your appetite for that kind of behavior, and you're taking resources away from the rational part of the soul. And so there's a recursive effect. Every time we permit ourselves to feed the part of us that isn't the rational part, not only do we do bad to ourselves in the individual act, but we perpetuate the behavior by feeding that part of our beast. But happily, there's also a recursive effect if we pursue knowledge, truth, and wisdom. At the heart of Plato's thinking is that reason can always tell us what to do with sufficient reflection and study. And so we ought always to live our life according to reason. Now, here's the question for you. Is Plato right? Is it true that I'm going to have the happiest life if I'm always making my decisions based on what reason tells me? Think about it, and we'll see you next time.